Hi, I'm Grady Culhane in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest who's come all the way from Nantucket, Chair of the Select Board, Brooke Mohr. Thank you for joining me today. It is a pleasure to have you in studio. Hope it was not a choppy ride or anything on the ferry today.
Nope, totally pleasant ride, uneventful.
Well, good. I don't want an eventful anything on the ferry. So I wanted to have you in today to talk a little bit about the happenings with Nantucket as of late. We're going to touch on housing, real estate transfer fees, as well as the fallout, shall we say, from the Vineyard Wind turbine from GE Vernova that did break apart a while back and that washed ashore on Nantucket beaches, led to some closures. So I wanted to ask, what has been some of the latest news on that front? Have you received communications? Is cleanup still ongoing? What's the latest on that?
So I do have regular communication both with state officials, the federal officials, and with folks from both Vineyard Wind and GE Vernova. And currently the activities that are happening with GE Vernova are the recovery of the pieces of the turbine blade that fell to the subsea floor. And they successfully retrieved one large section last week. Then they paused for weather, and they're back out there working on the remaining pieces that they had discovered at the bottom of the seafloor. They knew they were there. They had scanned for them and made a recovery plan. So that's happening. And then as far as the root cause analysis, the federal government is reviewing all of the engineering data, all the information. That process is underway at the federal level with BSEE. And I've also been working closely with both BSEE and the State Office of Energy and Environment on an environmental assessment. And they've engaged a firm called Arcadis. They've drafted an assessment framework, and they have done sampling of water, shellfish, and sediment, and those samples are at the lab undergoing testing now to determine the environmental impact of the blade failure.
All right, that is great to hear. Is there any kind of, did they offer a timeline on the results of that study? Or?
We're hoping in the next few weeks.
Okay, well, good luck. That is great to hear. Now, unfortunately, I just kind of wanted to ask you, obviously you were on the island. Are there currently any beach closures, and how much do you think this might have impacted the busy summer season for Nantucket? So
there were only beach closures for a couple of days afterward, but the debris kept washing up on the beach, and so the collection went on all summer long. There are still pieces of debris periodically showing up on the beaches now. We are in conversation with them about long-term plans to ensure that everything is collected over time, because as we know, the ocean moves things around and things may appear at a much later time. So making sure that Nantucket is protected in that recovery effort. So as far as the impact, we are actually about to be distributing a form so that local businesses can give us an assessment of any damages they experienced. So I think this will not be a promise of payment, but it will help us collect actual numbers of canceled charter boat trips. We had one fellow, Gavin, who spoke up at an early meeting about he runs a surf school and he had to shut down for a number of days. And so really better understanding what the financial impacts were to the community in a way that we can negotiate in cost recovery discussions with Vineyard Wind and GE Vernova.
Mm-hmm. All right, very interesting. Was there when you submitted out that survey, was there a deadline on when it needs to be back?
It's not out yet. It's about to come out.
Okay, sure. And you're hoping just by the end of the fall or something on that front?
Shortly, I hope.
Shortly. Ideally.
Yes. Yep.
All right. Well, that is good to hear. Is there anything, I did also want to talk about housing and stuff, but while we're still on the topic of Vineyard Wind, how do you want to respond to, how are the communications with the company and GE Vernova? Was there anything that you wish could have been done differently?
So many things could have been done better and differently. And I think one of the problems is that the industry standards set up by the federal government did not have a response plan for this type of incident. And so what I'm hoping to do is advocate for all coastal communities and really get policy change at the federal level on what all wind farms are required to do in terms of preparing for and being able to respond quickly, communicate effectively, and ideally prevent the debris from ever making it to the shore in the future, because they'll have plans in place based on the experience of this. We want to write policy that will impact all wind farms going forward. And I just had a meeting with Senator Markey's office today on this subject. So we're advocating all the way up to the federal delegation and to the federal regulators to try to affect that kind of policy change.
All right. Well, we will stay tuned on that front. It is certainly interesting developments, the unfortunate side effects of a new burgeoning industry without a lot of things laid down yet in policy. But
it's unpleasant to be the first community impacted by the industry, but hopefully we can take the learnings and make things better going forward.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for the update on that front. While you're here as well, I wanted to discuss some housing stuff as of late. We had the housing summit just recently where we had state officials coming down to the, you may be aware, there was also on the island just today. So can you talk a little bit more about having some state attention when it comes to the housing crisis that the Cape and Islands is dealing with, but Nantucket definitely hits worse there because it's such a limited space. Can you tell us a little bit about what the issues have been and having a state official on an island for today?
Yeah, so Secretary Augustus of the Office of Housing and Livable Communities was on Nantucket yesterday touring some of the projects that we've been doing to address the housing crisis and meeting with a lot of stakeholders, people impacted by lack of housing, and all of us who are working on it. And it was a really productive time together. And I'd like to thank the legislature and the administration for moving the Affordable Homes Act forward, and in particular the Seasonal Communities designation. Really gives us a lot of tools in the toolbox that we didn't have before, including being able to use government funding for municipal employee housing, being able to do more with tiny homes. There's so many pieces in that. I can't even start to list them off. The one piece that was missing was the transfer fee on real estate transactions to generate the revenue that we need. On Nantucket, with a median home price at about $3.5 million, the entry point for market rate real estate is well north of $1 million. There's rarely anything under 1.6 or 1.8 million that comes on the market. And there's a lot of competition for it when it does. And so we really do need to use some of these new tools, including a year-round deed restriction, which allows us to set aside properties for year-round occupancy in perpetuity in a way that we were not able to do under state law before. So another one of these excellent tools that we'll be deploying in Nantucket. But fundamentally, all the tools in the world can't solve the problem if we don't have enough money to subsidize the differential cost between what a market rate buyer would pay and what a local person can afford. Mm-hmm. And so having the most funding possible to make up that gap, both on the development of new units, acquiring deed restrictions on existing units, all the things that we can do. Fundamentally, funding is going to be a growing and necessary piece as real estate prices keep burgeoning, statewide and in an escalated fashion in Nantucket.
Record breaking on Nantucket as of late. Seems like I think we saw 28 million just a few weeks ago, and that was actually in the top 10, I believe, for all state real estate sales, historically.
Yeah, and that demand really trickles down all the way to the low end of the market, because when you have people driving up the price at the high end, buyers who would have bought in certain communities or certain areas are driven as price point down into what were traditionally year-round neighborhoods. So we're seeing that every piece of property is fair game, both to the seasonal buyer. And we also have a lot of employers who are buying up the less costly housing in the market to ensure that they have a place for their employees to live. And so it's a supply problem. And I think in the end, my goal has been that we have an adequate deed restricted market that is available only to year-rounders, so that we have a good balance between homes for the people who love to visit Nantucket and homes for the people who make the experience of the visitors a reality and make our community live, well, safe, and thriving. really.
We talked about this once before as well, but so you've lost municipal employees because of this issue as well. So has it been like a revolving door, or is it just like what's some of the anecdotes you might have to share?
So yesterday, the director of housing was telling us that when this was maybe a decade ago, she was part of a group that were a group of young professionals who had actually tried to get some housing solutions for themselves. And she said there were about 30 of them in this group, and there's only 3 that are left on Nantucket. So it's very difficult. People either can't find housing or they find it for a certain stage of their life. But then when they settle down and they want to have kids and they aspire to home ownership, that's where the road ends for them. And they end up deciding to leave Nantucket for communities where housing is more affordable. And it really is costly to the town in terms of recruitment and retention, retraining new people. And that's true for business nonprofits across the board. There's a high cost to turnover. And also, it's sad for the community. Folks seeing their friends pack up and go. It's really sad. Mm-hmm. And folks who are real contributors to the community, they're serving in town government, they're coaching, they're volunteering, they're just supporting their neighbors in other ways, and they just can't make it work. And that's a sad reality, and we would really like to address that and give people the opportunity to settle in either a rental or in a homeownership unit and really settle into the community for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Now, while you were here, we did have the annual town meeting has come and gone. We have covered the results of that. There's been multiple tries now to try to help address especially issues with short-term rentals specifically, which is kind of eaten into the long-term rentals that people like municipal workers would be using. So I wanted to ask kind of like how, unfortunately, they didn't pass this time around. If it was the right fit or not, I don't know. But can you talk a little bit more about the difficulties trying to craft policy to address the short-term rental issues that you guys are facing?
Sure. Just to clarify, it was a special town meeting.
Special town meeting, thank you.
There were 3 citizen warrant articles proposed. Well, there were more than 3, but there were 3 zoning articles proposed. And the select board convened representatives from those 3 groups that put the articles together in an attempt to come up with a compromise article. And as it turned out, the compromise was not acceptable to enough people to hit the 2/3 threshold. And I would say that there are constituencies that are looking to restrict short-term rentals a lot. And there's constituencies who are looking to reduce the restrictions or not have as much restriction. And the folks at either end of that spectrum have not found a compromise article that's been acceptable enough to them to find a middle, 70 2/3 threshold. So it's been about half-half. So we're just not getting there yet. Exactly. So I think it will continue, and I think I'm hoping, very much hoping, and I've said this in a select board meeting, that the folks who are on the ends of the spectrum will continue to try to collaborate to come up with something that is acceptable enough to get us to that 2/3 threshold, and that we can not have another go around or too many more go arounds on this.
How many years has it been back in meeting?
I'm trying to remember. I believe we've attempted at 4 or 5 annual and special town meetings. This has been on the warrant going back quite a ways. So 2021, maybe the first.
Well, yeah, because it was like
attempt.
The COVID pandemic is when I remember this being ramping up tenfold. It seemed so. That would.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real estate market and how dramatically it changed because of COVID really accelerated concern around the industry. It was growing altogether, but this marketplace. So we'll see. I think ultimately we have a town meeting for a form of government, and citizen legislators need to come together and find an appropriate compromise. I think there's been no shortage of effort on the select board's part since I've been on the select board, but we just haven't gotten there yet.
Sure.
So we'll see.
Now, we talked a little bit off microphone before as well, but you mentioned some interesting cultural changes that have been going on with Nantucket, or rather perhaps a lack of cultural changes to update with like the digital age that we now find ourselves in. Basically, I wanted to ask, like, why wasn't short-term rental as big of an issue until recently? Like, what changed between 1985 versus now when it came to the short-term rental industry, and why is it now becoming this skyrocketing issue?
So it's not unique to Nantucket. I think the digital platforms have really changed the marketplace in terms of people being able to access and get leases and come to Nantucket through that short-term rental market platform. And I think we're not the only community that has struggled with trying to address this the pressure that in seasonal communities, that seasonal buyers or seasonal homeowners, whether they're short-term renting or not, have on the marketplace and the availability of year-round housing. And there are different constituencies who disagree about the actual impact of short-term rentals per se on year-round housing. We don't really have strong numbers to quantify it, but because we're setting up a registration platform and regulations, and we will have more data to see what the market looks like into coming years, then I think maybe we can more factually analyze what's going on in the market. And that may help also in terms of deciding how to address it, because if you know more details about what you're trying to address, rather than anecdotal evidence, I think it will help us get there.
All right. Now, while you were here, I also wanted to touch on the how the ferries have been as of late. There's been some controversies surrounding that. But before we move topics, is there anything else you wanted to add about housing issues or short-term rental policy?
Nope. Just really hoping that folks out there listening will help us keep the transfer fee on the agenda at the State House and move it forward, because, you know, Nantucket's been at this for years, and then more Cape communities joined the effort, and now the housing crisis is really happening in communities statewide. And so it's a tool that could be useful not just for Nantucket, the islands, the Cape and Islands, but also for, some of the Western communities that have a big visitor population in the summer and so forth. So we want to keep that up front and center.
All right, we will stay tuned. Now, the Steamship Authority, there's some high-speed ferries that serve Nantucket, which you yourself took this morning, so very helpful. But there's been some, NOAA has proposed some restrictions on high-speed ferries for certain parts of the year to try and protect North Atlantic right whales, right, which you have mentioned before would be a big issue for Nantucket. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, just elaborate what the issue is, where we left off?
Sure. So NOAA had proposed speed restrictions for the ferries for all vessels over a certain size in Nantucket Sound from November to April. And what I think wasn't really considered was the impact on our lifeline, as we call it, which is the ferry system. And the impact really would be that it would shut down the fast ferry service those months, and it would add another half hour to the freight and car ferry. So it would reduce from 3 trips a day in the off season to 2. So basically everything that we need, food, building materials, medical supplies, everything that comes over, never mind our ability to come and go, to get medical care and for kids to play sports and all of that, would be so curtailed as to really change the way of life on Nantucket in an enormous way. And we've been advocating hard up through the federal level to get NOAA to reconsider and create an exemption for Nantucket Sound, where we know their data shows that that North Atlantic right whale does not ply those waters. And so it feels a little illogical, but the establishment of federal policy, as we've learned both here and with wind industry, is complex. It's difficult to get your voice heard, but we're very appreciative of the state. The director of Coastal Zone Management had an opportunity to weigh in on this and sent a very tightly worded letter and a lot of information up to NOAA, and the process has been delayed and is being sent back for further review. So we're hopeful that the right thing will happen in the long run, and this will never get implemented, and we won't ever have to experience the impacts that have me a little freaked out, honestly. If it were to happen, it would change everything for Nantucket.
Well, it seemed from our previous conversation, it seemed you implied that like school sports would just like stop functioning essentially, because now everything would have to become these overnight trips for like just basic games.
Well, it would be like setting back the clock. And if you talk to folks in their 40s and 50s who grew up in Nantucket and played sports, and they would, there were much fewer opportunities, and it was such a huge investment of time. So now you're talking about a 3-hour ferry ride each direction. You could not possibly get there and get back in a day. Now our teams leave in the afternoon and they come back on the late boat at night. So the kids are only off for the afternoon, and we have dozens and dozens, hundreds of kids who are on travel sports teams now that weren't available to them. They go and they travel off. Hockey families are off every weekend, and the boats are filled with kids heading off to games. And the fast boats, they don't take the slow boat because it's not a reasonable, a 5-hour round trip is just not viable for that. So the fast ferry really is significant. I know people who have traveled daily for radiation therapy at Cape Cod Hospital. And if they can't come home and sleep in their own bed between treatments and half the cost of a hotel off island, it's just unnecessary because the whales aren't there. So.
Mm-hmm. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you also mentioned in the past it would impede getting stuff off of the island, including like waste, which is something that was, not great to talk about, to think about, but it's important. Can you elaborate on that too?
Yeah. So the Department of Environmental Protection now has, I think we have 24 different waste stream collections on Nantucket. So things like mattresses and tires and appliances and all of these textiles, they are, for good reasons, environmentally segregating waste streams. The problem with having fewer ferry trips is we stockpile a lot of that material in the summer when ferry access is really limited because it's our busy season, and our DPW sends truckloads and truckloads of this waste off. And all construction waste cannot be landfilled in Massachusetts. So every time there's a building demolished or anything, that goes into has to be trucked off island. So imagine our absolute inability to comply with the regulations under which our waste management system works. We would be unable to comply because we'd be in essence on an ad hoc basis landfilling or stockpiling materials that are meant to go to recycling or licensed facilities where they're disposed of. So compliance issues, the list is endless in terms of what these ferry reductions would cost Nantucket.
All right. Well, we will also stay tuned on that front, with especially reaching out to some of the federal lawmakers and see if there's any other kind of exemptions, because I imagine that you're not the only community that would have to kind of be impacted by this. It's a blanket. It's not targeting the Steamship Authority. It was just a blanket regulation change.
It's vessels over, and I can't remember what the length of the vessel is, but certainly all of our ferries would be impacted.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we're about coming up on time, Brooke, but thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight for our listeners while I still have you?
No, I feel like we've covered a lot. Well, hopefully it's a good catch-up.
We have it. I know
what's going on over on our side of the pond.
Indeed, it's been great. We'll stay tuned on on all of the whale regulations, as well as some of the stuff with the real estate transfer fee. Actually, we just spoke with Cape and Island State Senator Julian Sear, who said that he was still looking into that transfer fee as well. So it seems like he's got some eyes on that too. Thank you again for joining me for this conversation. It has been a pleasure.
My pleasure as well. Thank you for having me.
I'm Grady Culhane, the CapeCod.com News Center, and thank you for listening.